Hi, this is Shambhavi. Welcome to my weekly podcast about spirituality, love, death, devotion, and waking up while living in a messy world. The Satsang with Shambhavi podcast is recorded live each week with students of our nonprofit community, Jayakula. For more information and to find out about attending a satsang, visit jayakula.org. Thanks for listening. Much love to you, wherever and however you are. When we're practicing in a tradition such as this, it's very important to remember that we're not trying to come up with a better version of ourselves. We're not trying to improve ourselves. We're not doing spiritual practice to have a self that'll be more successful necessarily. I mean, you might be, but that's not why we're doing it. We're not doing spiritual practice, presumably, to shore up our sense of goodness in an ordinary way, like to reassure ourselves that somehow we're good because we're doing spiritual practice better than other people. We're not trying to antidote feelings of insecurity with our spiritual practice. We're trying to not shore up our sense of small self. We're trying to unlearn all the things that we do to shore up our sense of small self. Because this conviction that we have, that we come in with through no fault of our own, that we're separate, that we inhabit just these bodies, that we have our own consciousness, that we are doing or should be doing important things, that something is very important is at stake in how other people think about us. All of these things that we hold on to are obstacles in our practice, and we are not trying to just get a better version of that. That would be what Swami Rudranandra called a horizontal move. So some people have a complaint about themselves that I don't know who I am. And they have some idea that by doing spiritual practice, they're going to come up with some narrative or some sense of self that is confined and coherent. So we're not trying to come up with a more coherent, more acceptable, more likable small me. That is not the purpose of the practice. That's the purpose that your karmas have assigned to you. The patterns of feeling and thinking that are telling you, I'm very important, or I want to be, and I want my life to be meaningful, and I want other people to recognize me, and I want to know who I am in those terms. I want to be able to say, here's me, here's what I stand for, here's what's good about me, here's what I'm good at, here's why you should like me. That is not what we're doing. If we could say in a shorthand what we're doing, is we are actually trying to become more open. Far from trying to shore up some sense of self that is going to make us feel more secure or better, we're actually trying to become more open to everything. We're trying to become less conditioned by the sense of being separate and small and fragile and important and striving for some kind of meaning. The self that says I am, is already perfect. It doesn't need any improvement. It doesn't need any defending. It doesn't need any meaning. It's everything, so it doesn't actually need to seek importance or validation from outside of itself. There is no outside. And so when we are being open, when we are being porous, when we are using our sadhana in the correct way, which is to release obscurations, release self-concepts, release limited concepts of ourselves, so that we can experience this openness to the self. When we are doing that, that's when we're discovering who we are. Not when we're sitting around contemplating laundry lists about ourselves, or trying to look at, who am I? Who am I? Who you are is not hidden in here. This idea of the self, that it's somehow individual and that we have to do something to prove the importance and meaningfulness of this individual little self, is at the root of all of our suffering. We think if I just get a better narrative about myself, and I can convince other people of my narrative, that's very important. It's not just good enough for me to have my narrative. Other people have to say, yes, that's how you are, I agree. If that happens, if we manage to get a more polished up, satisfactory version of ourselves, all coherent and explainable, we're still going to suffer. Because that version of ourselves is exceedingly fragile. It is threatened from every side, right? Someone can just come along and say, I don't agree that you're a kind person. We're suddenly thrown completely off course. And then we have to go into overdrive, proving something, right? So even if we have this perfect polished up version of ourselves, we like ourselves more in this ordinary way, we can be thrown off course by the slightest little, right? The only self that can really give us refuge is the self, the one that is everywhere. And when we say we are trying to know ourselves or discover who we are in this tradition, we mean that self. We mean that self that we really are, not that extremely limited version that we think we are. When we say that people are in a state of fixation or fantasy or somehow deluded about the nature of the self, the nature of their self, we mean that there are layers and layers and layers of patterns and concepts that are obscuring the real nature of the self from that person. We don't mean there's something wrong with you and you're being accused of having a fixation, or you're being, labeled of having some kind of a thing that's wrong with you. No, we're saying you don't exist the way you think you do. That's your central fixation, right? And then there are all these layers and layers and layers on top of that need to be released or removed so that the self that you already are can shine through. So that's why we say perfect from the beginning. Right? Most of us are going around with this idea that there's something wrong with us and we're going to fix it, and then everyone's going to approve of us, or we're going to get what we want, or we're going to feel impervious and safe. And it absolutely doesn't work, ever. If we look around just at people, everybody pretty much, with the exception of some people doing practice or who just came in with some other experience, is having some version of this experience of separateness and loneliness and individuality and self-defensiveness. And it comes in all different flavors. And for many people, it is all-consuming, right? This experience of individuality is all-consuming. They never have a glimmer of it being any different than that. And then we come to a practice, and we meet a tradition, and maybe we meet a teacher. We meet some teachings. We came because we had a glimmer that there was something else happening here. Right? We already had that glimmer before we showed up. And then we show up and we go, I'm going to get some help finding out what's really going on here and who I really am. And then we fight all the way to hold on to the limitations that we came to let go of. Kind of interesting. So, here in the US and other places in contemporary times, the relationship to these traditions from Asia is really impoverished. And one of the main ways that it's impoverished is that we don't understand how thoroughgoing a transformation is being offered to us through these practices. I mean, everybody tries to hold on to something they feel is comfortable, or some conviction they have that they think is worthy. Everybody does that for some time. But we also don't understand, by and large, what is actually being asked of us or offered to us, and how thoroughgoing a transformation it is to become this open, porous, uncontrived self that isn't so individualized. It's a fairly radical transformation in our way of being in the world. So there's sort of two ways that we hold on to things. One is just the average way that people do because we have fear, and we also have this momentum of thinking this is right and this is wrong and this is how things are, and yeah, I get it, you want me to change a little bit, but I'm not doing that thing's too radical. So we have that normal stuff. But then we also have this thing of not really getting what it's about. So that when we get asked to do something or let go of something, or we have some kind of experience that seems to be pointing in this more thoroughgoing way of letting go of our sense of small self, we might think it's wrong. Like we're being asked to do something wrong, or that it's too much, or it's not possible, or it's not even desirable. But we should remember what this is really about. Jayakula is definitely a place where you're asked to remember that. I mean, it's one of the things that I feel is important to remind people, that these traditions that come out of India and China and Tibet and other parts of the world are meant to radically transform your experience of self. They're meant to radically release you from your contrivance, from your concepts about things, from your attachment to the rationality that accrues to being a creature having an experience of linear time. I mean, your sense of time changes also, not just your sense of self. And the sense of immediacy is really sort of the first way that your sense of time changes. This is actually what it's about. And it's important to remember that. It doesn't mean that every person that comes to Jayakula is going to want to go that far or be here for that reason. But if anybody says, I'm your student, I want to be your student in some way that's more thoroughgoing, this is what it's about. And this is why I'm doing it. Right? I mean, it's great to be able to help people in whatever way it's possible to help them. I mean, even if it's just something fleeting. Like, I loved that moment we had in the co-op. I wish I could do that every day. It was just such a beautiful opportunity, right? It would be great to just wander around, giving people hugs when they need a hug, and having a conversation when they need a conversation. And, that would be a wonderful life as far as I'm concerned. So it's not like I have to be in this particular kind of relationship with everybody. Anything is fine. Any way of giving your joy and giving your love is great. But it's good to remind ourselves that this self that you're so frantic about is just a construct. It's an ephemeral construct. It's an echo a very pale echo of that larger self. When we say that you want to be immersed in presence, that's what we mean. Be immersed in the self. That's what presence means. So that's sort of the central instruction of this tradition, is be immersed in presence. And then we have lots of ways of talking about that. It means let go of your constructs, let go of your concepts, let go of your sense of physical boundary, emotional boundary, intellectual boundary, energetic boundary, every boundary you have, and become immersed in that continuous sense of presence. Ma said that's all you need to do, really. So we try to learn to recognize that presence, right? I have to recognize it before we can sort of integrate with it. So the first step, of course, is recognition. That's in both the Trika tradition And also Dzogchen, the first step is recognition. So we have to have a lot of techniques to help people to recognize, and transmission and all kinds of things happening, all these things that we do are to help people to recognize. And then when you have a firm recognition, then you can start doing other kinds of things to have a recognition more often. But eventually you find yourself just continually feeling yourself as an aspect of that presence. And then you have to deepen that over lifetimes and lifetimes. But this is what it's about. It's not about being right or being important or being meaningful or being recognized or being anything. It's not about being anything. It's not about discovering who your individual self is. It's almost completely unimportant. So if anyone had forgotten this, I just wanted to remind you that this is what it's actually about. And if you're going to go or try to go that far, I mean, obviously there's no end of this, and I'm just on the path like you are. But if you're going to go on that path, you have to be willing to let go of your small self construct and have your construct challenged in all sorts of ways. Because you may think, well, I'm right about this, or I'm justified in that, or whatever. But actually it's not about a contest about whether you're justified or whether you're right or whether what you're saying is true. It's about letting go of all of it. It's not about coming to a decision about any of it. Right? It's a very important point. In this kind of tradition, you get challenged not to change your ideas about things, but to not have any ideas about things. That's very different. Why don't we want to have ideas about things? Because we want to have experience of things as they're arising. And any old idea that we have, any repetitive idea that we have, any repetitive pattern through which we're relating to things, all of that is standing in the way of the immediacy of living presence. So it's not about whether anybody agrees with anything that anybody says or what they do, or it's about getting rid of all those ideas about things. Right? That's the only way to clear your senses so that you can feel presence. It's the same reason we do loud mantras sometimes, those of you that have taken Sahaja training. It's very sharp, loud sound so that we can clear our senses and clear our mind and have an experience of immediacy. I just think that sometimes we forget what it's actually about, right? Conveniently. Or maybe we didn't even know, or we hadn't fully grasped what it's actually about. But I tell you, before I started this practice, I always felt like there was something between me and everything else. Now, I couldn't have really said what it was, but it was some kind of feeling of alienation that I'm sure everybody feels some way of experiencing alienation. For me, it felt almost like I couldn't reach things, like there was something invisible between me and everything. And I have to say that when you do let yourself be dismantled, and that means not putting anything in place of the constructs and convictions and concepts that you have now. When you do let yourself be dismantled in that way, then that sense of alienation completely goes away. I mean, it's a miracle, really, that I can look out at you and just feel there's absolutely no distance between us. It is a miracle.